proceed even if
Hey everyone, I think we'll get started. So we think this is live streaming, but we're not totally sure on the audio. So it's extra lucky to be here in person to hear it and not just watch it. So I'm Taylor Owen. I'm the research director of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism here at the Journalism School, which is hosting tonight. For those of you who don't know, the Tao Center is a pretty new center within the school, and we do a whole host of research, teaching, outreach in the space of digital journalism. One of the themes, our core research themes and the themes we work on, is on data and computational journalism. And one of our fellows in that space is Nick Diakopoulos, who's here, and who has put together a really remarkable speaker series for this year in the space of computational and data journalism. And Ethan is here to kick it off for us. And it's my delight to welcome him here to the Journalism School. In 2004, Ethan founded Global Voices, a global network of bloggers, translators, and citizen journalists. And I think it's worth, from a digital journalism perspective, reflecting on just what the digital media landscape looked like in 2004. And I was a PhD student, I was blogging on various sites, none of which were seen as part of the media in any real way. And yet, the network they put together brought a whole host of new voices into the traditional media conversation, and ended up growing to this really remarkable, diverse network of contributors from over 130 countries, publishing in 20 languages. And I think the idea that you could actually make a news network out of these diverse voices at the time was really radical, and it's worth recognizing that in light of the topic of the talk tonight. Ethan's now the director of the Center for Civic Media at MIT, which at Tao Center we sort of see as our more edgy, cooler, a little bit smarter cousin, aspirationally, of course. And this year he released a book to pretty wide acclaim. In Rewire, Digital Cosmopolitanism in the Age of Connection, Ethan asks why with all of the connectivity in the internet facilitated by digital media, are we not better citizens? Why are we not more cosmopolitan? Why are we not more tolerant and celebratory of our differences? And so I think you can say the same thing about the digital media landscape and the space of digital journalism right now. Why, with such diversity and richness of content, are we not more informed, more engaged? Why are we not better citizens? And what if news organizations and media networks were designed to incentivize this new form of civics? Ethan, we look forward to your answer to that question. And just a quick note, we are trying to live stream this. The hashtag for these talks are Tao Talks, and you can tweet questions at the Tao Center, and we'll ask them to them at the end. So Ethan, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot, Taylor, and it's really nice to be here. And we very much see the Tao Center as a sister center, and I don't accept any of the characterizations of how the centers relate to one another, but thrilled to be here, thrilled to be part of it, thrilled to have a lot of old friends here. So I think the talk was supposed to be called New News, New Civics, which is a phrase I'm using a lot. I've actually reversed the two because I'm really interested actually in focusing perhaps more on the civics piece of this. And I'm going to apologize at the start of this talk, which is to say that I have a talk that I could give you. It's nice, it's polished, it's really good. It's about the book that I just published. And I could give it to you, but I'm really bored with giving it, and this is a room full of people that I actually kind of want the opinions of, and I want to get some thinking from. So I'm not going to talk about that at all. If you want to read it, it's a fine book, and you can hear me talk about it elsewhere, but I actually want to talk about something entirely different. I want to talk about these guys. And my guess is that everybody in the room knows who these guys are. When you look at Julian Assange, Aaron Swartz, of blessed memory, and Ed Snowden lined up, there's a lot of things you could sort of draw as a common ground. They're all nerdy white guys. They're all geeks who have ended up having an enormous amount of visibility in the media. They're all folks who have brought issues to the fore, really Aaron after his death, but for Julian and Edward during their lives, that might not have been in a media dialogue otherwise. And these are issues that get very deep into the world of law, the world of civics. They're major fundamental issues about how our governments function, about access to information, about access to documents. And so what I'm actually interested with these guys is sort of thinking about them as a class. And I want to think of them as a different class of citizens than we're used to thinking about. My argument is that when you look at Julian, when you look at Aaron, when you look at Ed, what you're looking at are people who have a very different toolkit than most of us have for civics. When we think about how we participate in civics, and here I have to be embarrassed by the fact that I'm basically drawing all of this from Michael Schutzen's work, and he's sitting here, and if I get it wrong, I'm going to feel really bad about getting it wrong. But he has a brilliant book called The Good Citizen that makes this argument that a lot of how we think about civics comes out of the progressive era. It comes out of this notion that we think what it means to be a citizen is that we're well informed, we read the newspaper, we read up about ballot propositions, and then we go off and armed with all that information, we make an intelligent decision, either voting directly on a law or voting for a representative. And I want to make the case that that's a pretty limited and shallow version of citizenship, which Michael makes an argument for as well. But I think we're starting to see a slightly different version of citizen emerging. And I think this is a citizen that has access to multiple different capabilities. This is someone who, as a citizen, as a civic actor, is finding ways to influence law, is finding ways to influence policy, but also to influence markets, to influence code, to influence social norms. And I think that when you think about these guys, these are guys who were playing or are playing in multiple different spaces. It's not that Ed Snowden managed to get a huge cache of documents out of an extremely secure facility just because he's an awesome hacker and tech guy. That's a big piece of it, and his technical expertise is enormously important. But he's also someone who was thinking very, very carefully about social norms and how you influence public opinion, how you get this information out there to the general public. And so he's not just playing in a technical sphere, he's playing in a press sphere. And he's playing in a legal sphere as well, because many of the questions that he wants to ask are these sort of questions about law. So I think when you think of these folks who have these sort of richer tool belts, they've got a number of different tools that they can use to be civic actors in one fashion or another. I'm taking a lot of my inspiration from Biella Coleman. And Biella last year published an absolute must-read book. It's just incredibly helpful. It's a book called Coding Freedom. And Biella's an ethnographer, and she does what really good ethnographers do, which is she takes a really deep dive into a community. She basically becomes part of that community, and in her case, the deep dive is in the free software movement. And so she spends 8 or 9 years watching things like Debian Linux and trying to figure out how that project gets built, what are the values, what are the practices of all of it. And she comes out with this book that basically says, your picture of people who build open source software is way limited. If you think of people as spending all of their time sitting in front of a monitor, antisocial, no friends, you're missing the point. There's actually an enormous amount of sociability, there's an enormous amount of culture behind this. There's all sorts of interactions that are sort of non-obvious to you. But beyond that, these sort of hackers, these people who are building open source software, are incredibly multifaceted and multi-talented. A lot of them are deeply political. They're deeply engaged with the political issues of intellectual property and such. And to give an example of this, she pulls up Seth Shawn. And Seth Shawn is a fascinating guy. He's the lead technologist for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. But the example where she pulls up Seth Shawn is this great example of sort of the multifaceted geek, right? So let's go back a little bit in computing history. There's a very famous case around DECSS. And this is a tool that allows you to play a DVD on a Linux-based computer. And to do this, you need to be able to decrypt the DVD because DVDs are all encrypted. So you have to find a way to decrypt the DVD so you can actually play it on the screen. And this is a player that isn't licensed. It hasn't been licensed by the owners of the DVD standard. And so by various interpretations, it is a crime to decrypt the DVD that you've bought and make it play on your Linux machine. And it's a crime to write the code to decrypt this. Now this gets really interesting. How does it become a crime to write code? You know, code at the end of the day is a set of instructions. It's really just a giant long number that tells a computer to do something. So there ends up being in the free software community this giant conversation about how do we have civil disobedience around a really silly piece of intellectual property law. And so the idea that people come up with is we need to find ways to disobey the prohibition on writing DVD decrypting software. And we need to show how absurd it is, the idea that you could ban writing a DVD decryptor. So Seth Shawn looks at this and says, I'm going to do it as a poem. I'm going to write a set of linked haikus, 456 of them. It starts actually slightly further before this. It actually starts with a free software disclaimer. But then he opens it with, Muse, when we learned to count, little did we know the things we could do. Someday by shuffling those numbers, Pythagoras said all his numbers. And it goes on to explain what he's doing poetically, but then goes on further to actually be a functioning algorithm that you could use to decrypt a DVD. So by creating this poem, he has written a program that violates the law in exactly the way that DECSS violates the law. But if you want to prevent distribution of this poem, you basically have to censor a work of art. Now, this is a great protest, and ultimately we prevail. You can actually watch DVDs on Linux. But my point on all of this is when you look at a guy like Seth Shawn, this is someone who is playing in 3 different spaces simultaneously. He's playing in the realm of code. This is a program. It actually works. This is a guy who's playing in the realm of law. He understands this interesting, complicated legal issue of whether this program is legal or not. He's playing in the realm of art, whether this is high art or whether this is merely a very persuasive piece of rhetoric. He's someone using multiple toolkits. And so the way that I've started thinking about these sort of multifaceted civic individuals is through the lens of a book that was really influential on Shawn. It was really influential on almost everybody Biela was talking to in her book, which is Larry Lessig's book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. And so in this book, Lessig coins this really memorable phrase. He says, code is law. And what he means by this is when you put something into software, you can make certain behaviors possible that weren't possible before, and you would also restrict other behaviors. So before you have code, you suddenly, have no particularly good ability to make a phone call except through the phone system. But once you've brought code into the world, suddenly you have voice over IP. We have Skype. We can do something that we couldn't do previously. That's a behavior that's possible that wasn't possible before. You can also restrict behaviors. You can basically say, I'm not going to allow you to put a voice over IP application on your iPhone because I want to make sure that you're using the phone through the carrier. So code giveth and code taketh away. And for a lot of people, what was really interesting about this was a sense that we assumed that the way that our world was restricted, the way that it was regulated, was that it was regulated mostly by laws. Behaviors were legal or illegal. And then Larry sort of comes up and says, well, once you're in code, behaviors are possible or not possible. And he sort of goes further. He basically says, when we regulate, he's talking specifically about regulating technology, but it's actually worth looking a little more widely than that. When we regulate the world, we tend to use 4 forces. We use law. That's legal to do or it's not legal to do. We use code. That's possible or not possible. We use markets. It's cheap to do something or it's expensive to do something. And we use norms. You're encouraged to do something, you're not encouraged to do something. Now, Lessig is writing this book right after he's been the court-appointed master in Ashcroft versus Microsoft. So he's just spent 2 years wrestling with this question of whether Microsoft should be allowed to require Internet Explorer to be bundled with Windows 95. Are they allowed to basically shove a browser down your throat? And so he's really concerned about is code taketh away. He's concerned about this idea that the Windows operating system says you can behave this way, you can't behave this other way. And in the process of this, he becomes sort of a flaming advocate for be able to do whatever you want with the code. Don't let code restrict you from what you're going to do. But I think what's really useful is that he suggests that there's all these other forms of control that we have to take seriously as well. Markets end up being really profound. When you have people starting to look at questions of why there's such a serious obesity epidemic in the United States, one of the things that a lot of people come down to is they say, we put billions of dollars every year into making corn incredibly cheap. And if you want to make cheap foodstuffs and have success in the marketplace, having access to high fructose corn syrup suddenly becomes a great way to change that playing field. If we subsidized food in a different way, you would probably have other foods that were easier to eat than high fructose corn syrup. You would end up regulating and making certain things easier or certain things harder based on regulating through markets. Regulating through norms tends to be one of the ones that we absolutely have the hardest time with. Norms are incredibly important. In the tech industry, we don't pay enough attention to them. Google Glass right now is having a fight almost entirely about norms. Whether Google Glass succeeds or fails has to do with whether we decide that we're okay with people pointing cameras at us all the time. If that becomes a socially acceptable norm of people wearing this stuff and recording things all the time, it will become pervasive. We'll have another change in sort of pervasive surveillance culture. But you have people fighting on the other direction of this. You have a guy like Jan Chipchase, sort of a leading tech ethnographer, essentially saying, when you see someone with Google Glass, you should throw a bucket of water in their face. That's basically a normative argument in the other degree. We're not okay with that norm changing. Norms are really hard for tech people to understand, and it's why so much technology fails. They're also incredibly powerful, and people who've done social change have looked at social change through norms for years. Actually, some of the most successful social change through norms we've ever had has been around the issue of drunk driving. You had the Harvard Project on Alcohol start going after drunk driving in 1990 in a very serious way. We've had a 49% fall in fatalities from drunk driving in that period, which is kind of insane if you think about it. And there's a lot of things that have contributed to it. We have laws that are much more aggressive about it. We have checkpoints and so on and so forth. But there's also been this really coordinated, dedicated campaign to get people to think about things like designated drivers. And the reason we have Norm from Cheers here is not just the cheap pun. Actually, Cheers is the first place that the Harvard Project on Alcohol tried this out. They went to Cheers and said, can you just mention in an episode the notion of the designated driver. The designated driver is an idea that had been around in Sweden since the 1930s, had had no traction in the US, but the idea was not to have a very special Cheers where Woody, finally almost kills somebody, but just have it mentioned as something that happens. So there's an episode of Cheers where Norm gets stuck being the designated driver for the bar, and it's his worst day of his life because he has to drink water while everybody's drinking beer, and it's just a side plot point. But it's seen by like a third of the US TV audience. And this is part of this campaign to get that norm shift to come into the public opinion. So it shows up in Hollywood, it shows up in TV. Over time, you're trying to have that change around alcohol by sort of saying, here's a different way to think about it. Here's a different way to think about something like designated driving. Here's the point of all of this. The reason I'm going back to Lessig and looking at this question of how do you shape behaviors through code, through markets, through norms, is that I think it's actually a really hard time to get change through law. I spend a lot of time right now at Center for Civic Media thinking about how we teach civics. At the end of the day, that's my job, is to sort of think about what does the world of civic education look like, and how do we build news that helps people prepare for a world of civics? And a lot of what we know about civics is teaching people how laws get made and how laws get enforced. But we're at a moment where laws aren't getting made and aren't getting enforced. Whether it's extreme partisanship, whether it's simply the relationship between this particular Congress and this particular executive, we've hit a point where looking for meaningful, massive social change through passing laws is very hard to persuade people that that's the easiest path forward. Probably still the most powerful path. In the end of the day, if you really want to change, like legalization of gay marriage, you really want a constitutional amendment on marriage equality. But you also have to recognize that you're probably going to need to work in those other spaces as well. Marriage equality is actually an excellent one. If you want to get marriage equality, you need changing norms around what people think about gay marriage and what people think about gay people. So you're probably looking for a way to fight on multiple different fronts. And you may not be fighting first and foremost on the front of law. It's a way to get incredible change at scale and have the whole apparatus of government behind you to support that change. But it may not be what's most accessible to people as civic actors. So I'm looking at these guys and I'm sort of saying, I'm trying not to think of them as whistleblowers. I'm trying not to think of them as basically poking their fingers in the eyes of the US government. I'm trying to think of them as effective civic actors. And I think the reason that they're such effective civic actors is that they're trying to figure out how to fight for change on multiple fronts at the same time. And they're able to do it because they have a set of competencies, in each of their cases probably in-house, that's maybe well beyond what many of us have. But I also think there's really interesting lessons for how all of us would sort of choose to do civics based on how we've seen these guys do civics. So if I were trying to teach civics at the moment, I would probably not be encouraging everyone to be Edward Snowden. It's hard to know how that works at scale. But you might try encouraging everybody to be Carmen Rios. Carmen Rios is a 23-year-old university student in DC. She's an activist, she's a writer, shows up all over the place, bylines on all sorts of online media. She's very involved with a group called Spark, which is an anti-sexism group. And she got incredibly incensed by the Steubenville rape case. And her response to Steubenville was to say, I'm really worried that our high school athletic culture is creating a sense of entitlement where young men feel like they can transgress on women's rights. And so I want to make sure that high school athletic culture takes as its responsibility training young men about sexual violence and sexual assault. I want this to happen within the athletics program. And so her response to this was to team up with someone at Colby College, who's a college football player, who'd come through the high school athletic system, identify who she wanted to persuade, figured out that the place that she would have the most leverage was going after the National Federation of State High School Associations, which is basically the national group of football and basketball coaches. Put together an online campaign, mobilized a huge amount of people, got 700,000 petition signatures, and almost immediately got a response from the head of this organization, who is now working with her to create this curriculum within the high schools. Now, there's a lot of ways that she could have looked for this change. She could have looked for a law at the local or the state or the federal level that basically said you were required in the course of high school athletics within the public schools to teach, a class against sexual assault. But that wasn't the path that she took. And whether that was a tactical decision or whether it was simply a decision that she knew the forces that she could manipulate, she ended up having enormous success, not by going after the legal side of it, but going after this lever of norms, going after social pressure, and basically raising this idea that this should actually be a responsibility of what people are doing in the space of high school athletics. So the argument that I really want to make, and where this finally is actually going to get into data and journalism in the newsroom, and I thank you for your patience in sort of letting me get that far, is that I think that a lot of people who are taking civic action, who are becoming an activist in one fashion or another, are playing primarily in the sphere of attention. And I think attention has become the utterly critical commodity that sort of underlies most of our civics and what many of us do as civic actors. And I think about attention very much the way that Herbert Simon started talking about it when he started talking about attention scarcity, which was to basically say, once you move into a world where it's much, much cheaper to create information, information's no longer scarce. What's scarce is our ability to pay attention to it. And so in that world, that ability to move and shape attention, to draw attention to the issues that you care about, to swing around a lot of people to pay attention to your cause and potentially help you amplify it and help you share it, becomes a form of political power. It becomes a way in which you can become an effective citizen. And a huge amount of the work that we are doing at Center for Civic Media is sort of trying to understand how people are shaping and directing attention at this moment in time and how attention sort of works within media ecosystems. Ton of our work lately has been trying to figure out the story of Trayvon Martin. And I don't mean the story of Trayvon Martin in terms of what happened on that evening and whether there was a fight and why George Zimmerman shot him and what's come out of it. What we've actually been trying to figure out is how did the news story of Trayvon Martin become a national debate about race? And if you think about it, it's actually a very unusual situation. The Trayvon Martin case gets reported only in a couple of local newspapers. It's a couple of paragraphs mentioned. You basically see a tiny blip of media attention. You don't see it outside of Central Florida. And then silence. And then it comes back, and it sort of comes back with a vengeance to the point where it ends up dominating American media dialogue for 3 months until you get the arrest of Zimmerman. And then it comes back again with a vengeance when you actually get the verdict in the trial. And news stories don't do this, right? If you graph out news stories, they spike really fast. They decay generally pretty quickly. If someone manages to sort of reframe them, you might get a second bump of relevance. But this sort of little bump, nothing, and then sort of a build again is actually extremely unusual. And so we've done this very deep dive using a set of tools that we've been building for about 5 years now called Media Cloud. And what Media Cloud does is it grabs every story we can get our hands on. It's a specialized search engine to understand the media ecosystem. So we're subscribed to about 50,000 newspapers and blogs. We're adding Twitter, we're adding a lot of other capabilities to it, and we're grabbing those stories, we're dating them, we're looking at the link structure. And what we're able to find is that we can sort of rewind and look at how a story plays itself out. And so we start digging into the Trayvon story, and what we end up finding out is that almost all the narratives around it are wrong. One of the common narratives around it is that you have a lot of movement from the African American community, you have a change.org petition, and that's what gets everyone paying attention to it. And all that's true, but it actually kind of misses this critical piece of it. The story disappears entirely. Trayvon Martin's family hires a lawyer named Benjamin Crump, who hires a PR consultant who goes out and tries to pitch the story, which ends up on CBS News. So it actually hits broadcast media first. That in turn gets watched by folks on a Men of Howard University listserv who start spreading it through African American media, which ends up on the petition. And so we can sort of watch this and sort of rewind over time. And as we've gone through this whole thing, we've got a 60-page paper coming out on this, sort of looking at the whole thing, we're starting to learn some of the rules of how people play effectively in this space. So when we look at like how does someone like a Carmen Rios do this, we're starting to get a sense. And so two sort of giant lessons that we've gotten from this. One is that you can't do this all digitally. It turns out that digital media just doesn't have the reach. Even if you're reaching hundreds of thousands of people, that's not actually how you set a national agenda. National agendas get set in the millions. So broadcast media turns out to still be enormously important. What online media is really powerful for is it's an on-ramp. And so the game that's being played within media ecosystems right now are people trying out framings on online media, hoping that they're going to get amplified by broadcast media in one fashion or another. And it turns out that there are moments where broadcast media is incredibly vulnerable. Once a story has gotten to the point that it's actually a television story sustained over some period of time, broadcast needs a new story every day. You need something else that's going to hit that 24-hour news cycle. So if someone comes up and says, here's what the Trayvon Martin story is really all about, people are amazingly receptive to that. So we watched bloggers on the right sort of try, over the course of 2 weeks, different approaches to the Trayvon was to blame for the shooting. We watched them try, Trayvon was a thug, Trayvon had a gold tooth, Trayvon had tattoos, Trayvon smoked marijuana. We finally watched the Trayvon is a drug dealer frame get picked up. And you can watch this happen, and it's the funniest thing because what happens is mainstream media comes in and says there's no evidence that Trayvon's a drug dealer. But that keeps the notion of drug dealer in play. And then you'll see people on the fringe essentially saying, why would they be talking about this unless there were credible evidence that Trayvon is a drug dealer? And you sort of watch this go back and forth. And over time, that becomes one of the allowable frames on this. And it's not just the right. The left does this as well on Trayvon. The left at a certain point figures out that they can hitch the American Legislative Exchange Council, this corporate council that's out there sort of suggesting law, and essentially say, hey, American Legislative Exchange Council, they're the guys who wrote Stand Your Ground. If you're really upset about Trayvon, you don't have to confront racism, you just have to confront corporate money in politics. That's the way to do this. So you get these stories and you watch people with these competing agendas try to seize that sort of giant, glowing mass of attention and sort of steer it over to their cause in one fashion or another. And we're seeing this in a number of different places. We're going to be sort of the second paper in the series. The first paper in the series is a great paper that Yochai Benkler over at Harvard has done on media attention around SOPA and PIPA. So another great story. You have a piece of legislation, totally uncontroversial. 18 months later, you have Wikipedia blacking itself out, and you have 100 sponsors fall back from the legislation the next day. How do you get there? SOPA PIPA plays out almost entirely digitally. You can watch the entire thing online. It has almost no broadcast in it at all. Trayvon seems to be all about broadcast. It seems to be all about how do you influence broadcast, how do you shape it into different places. The third paper that we're working on, and we're in really early stages of it, but it is kind of interesting, is an attempt to look at the California ballot propositions. So we've grabbed as much information as we can on all the California ballot propositions in 2012. We've created huge sets of local media. We've got all the local Twitter around it. And what we're basically finding is there's no public dialogue around it. These ballot measures are out there. People vote on them. They're really important. They involve genetically modified foods. They involve the death penalty, major tax changes. We can find almost no discussion either online or offline. And so for me, this raises some really interesting questions. It raises these questions about where those levers for civic engagement end up being. I think there's amazing power to sort of say, I'm going to take an issue that I really care about, like sexual violence against women, and say, I'm going to push this to the forefront. And whether or not it's directly attached to legislation, I don't know if that's the most important thing. I think at this point, if you want to capture the attention, it becomes a space where a lot of people are trying to work. So we're trying to document these ecosystems. We're trying to document these ecosystems not just in terms of sort of mapping how a controversy takes place. We're also trying to understand sort of what the baseline is. What do we pay attention to? What don't we pay attention to on a regular basis? And a lot of the work that we've been doing over at Center for Civic Media at the moment is trying to understand who gets talked about and who doesn't get talked about on sort of a routine basis. So we've been doing a partnership with the Boston Globe, geolocating every article that they published over the last 2 years. And on this level of it, this is work being done by my grad student, Catherine D'Ignazio. It's reassuring that the Boston Globe covers Boston. We're pleased to see that. It's a nice way of sort of checking the tool. Where it gets interesting is when we start breaking it out into stories per capita. So we start looking at the stories over the last 2 years. We put them over the populations of each of the parts of the Boston metropolitan area. And we start getting this very distinctive pattern. We pay a lot of attention in the center city. Makes sense, center of government. We get a lot of attention out in these very wealthy western suburbs. We get surprisingly little attention in these inner ring suburbs. And so if you look at that sort of area right below Boston, that area tends to be poor and black. If you look at that white area above it, that area tends to be poor and white. And in those communities, you get far fewer stories per capita. And then when you actually dig into what those stories actually are, very interesting things come out. So here is TF-IDF, term frequency inverse document frequency. Here are the words that are more common in articles about the city of Mattapan, the neighborhood of Mattapan, than the Boston Globe as a whole. Mattapan is a majority community of color, quite disadvantaged. When you start looking through this, you'll see pretty quickly killings, juror, police. Juror shows up in about 3 different places as jury and juror. Basically, an enormous number of the stories of Mattapan are stories about murder. And it's not necessarily that Mattapan is the murder capital of Boston, but that's what makes it into the newspaper. And this raises some really interesting questions about how a community gets represented. If you sort of accept my argument that one of the ways that we do civic engagement and civic action is through shaping and modifying attention, when you look at a backdrop like this, where you basically say what Mattapan gets attention for is murders and basketball, this is a really challenging way to get people to sort of pay attention to issues in your community or priorities within your community. So a lot of the work that we're trying to do is sort of asking these questions about what are we paying attention to, where, what are the limits in it, what are the blind spots in it. And we're now starting to take this work and sort of go globally. I've been making maps like this. This is a map of what the New York Times pays attention to over the last month or so. I've been making maps like this for about 10 years, and then we're starting to try to make these maps for other news sources. So this is the New York Times. This is the Huffington Post. If it's not immediately obvious, we can go back and forth between them a little bit. The New York Times, for whatever bad things you want to say about it, has a much broader worldview than the Huffington Post, even sort of declaring itself something that's trying to look and have a global scene. And our next step on this is to sort of ask the question, what are we talking about when we're talking about Syria? How do different media outlets talk about Syria? What do they talk about when they talk about Syria? What would we find out about that baseline? What are the preconceptions that we might want to try to figure out how to address? If Mattapan doesn't want to be known for murder and basketball, who do they appeal to? Are there other media where they can try to find a different form of representation? Does that become another path for activism? We're trying to find ways not just to sort of show this stuff, but to actually do things around this. One of my students, Nathan Matias, got obsessed with gender in media last year. Got really obsessed with the idea that the composition of newsrooms was getting steadily more balanced between males and females up until about the 1980s, and then it levels off, and now it's getting worse. You're having fewer and fewer women by proportion in the newsroom. And his feeling was, well, there's pieces of this that we can fix, there's pieces that we can't fix. So he's built a great little tool. It takes a text file, it identifies the names, and it makes a reasonable guess about whether a name is male or female. It sees the name Alyssa, it says probably female, it sees the name Pat, sort of shrugs its hands and says, I can't really decide on that one. But one way or another, it tries to give you a gender breakdown on this. And so he then throws this at the New York Times obituaries over the last 20 years. So these are words that appear in the New York Times obituaries. It's coded in blue if it appears in a man's obituary. It's coded in yellow if it appears in a woman's obituary. You'll see a lot of blue up there. There's something like 10 times as many male obituaries as female obituaries. The only word that comes up yellow is husband. That's the only word that shows up in more women's obituaries. But then you sort of drill down on this. And so in this case, I'm drilling down on the word leadership. And what this does is it pulls up every one of those obits in the New York Times where a woman was mentioned in the context of leadership. And it invites you to go read that obit and to check whether the woman in question has an entry in Wikipedia. And the logic behind this is that if you were relevant enough to have an obit in the New York Times, you might well be relevant enough to have a Wikipedia article. And Wikipedia, which by the way you can change as opposed to the New York Times obits, has an enormous gender problem, has an enormous underrepresentation, and it becomes a path through which you can actually find a way to do something. So finding ways to sort of air these biases, finding ways to air what we pay attention to and we don't pay attention to is only part of the step. Trying to figure out ways where you could actually get involved with changing and correcting is another piece of it. Another thing that Nathan's done in this is he's tried to build tools that let you look at your own behavior. So you're not just questioning the New York Times, you're questioning what you're doing. So this is a tool, this is live, it's up at followbias.org. It's followbias.com, you'll find it somewhere, that looks at who you follow on Twitter. And this is actually my data, embarrassing as it is. I follow about 1,100 people on Twitter. I follow a lot more men than women. And having this revealed actually starts raising these questions. How do I feel about this? Am I okay with this? Should I be finding more women to pay attention to? We're trying to build mirrors. These mirrors might be for you, they might be for your own behavior, they might be for a newsroom to sort of say, hey, Boston Globe, maybe you have a problem with Mattapan. They might be for news consumers to sort of say, hey, if you're paying attention to these papers and not to others, maybe you're missing these parts of the world. But we're doing this because we think that a huge way in which people try to have influence over civics today is by participating in this media ecosystem space. And I think at the moment, we tend to understand it intuitively, we tend to understand it procedurally, we haven't spent a lot of time sort of looking at it from the top down. So the big points that I'm trying to make on this, I think that any media ecosystems that we're looking at, we have to start thinking about as basically civic battlegrounds. Anyone who is looking for change is or should be trying to shape our agenda, trying to shape what we're paying attention to, should be trying to seize that information. And whether we're here as reporters or whether we're sort of scholars of social change, we need to be aware of this idea that what we're reading and what we're not reading is actually part of this sort of ongoing dispute of people campaigning for that scarce resource of attention. I think one of the other things that we have to start learning in this space is that this notion of the neutral, unbiased source is bullshit. We're all biased. And bias doesn't necessarily mean I lean politically to the left and therefore I see everything through that lens. Bias is every number of different biases. We're biased in terms of what we think is important and not important. When we give attention to something, whether we're an editor in a newsroom saying we're going to run this story rather than that story, when I'm tweeting something or not tweeting something on Twitter, when I'm starting a conversation about it, when I'm giving a talk about it, all of those are decisions about where I'm going to shape that attention, what I'm going to argue for the importance and the prominence of. And so this is taking me to the really hard part of the talk that I really haven't figured out what I'm going to say. So if you were confused and lost for now, it's going to get even worse. I think that as we move into the space where people are trying to have influence on civics through shaping media to try to influence norms, through building code to try to make new behaviors possible, peer-to-peer file sharing, different security protocols to try to lock the NSA out. When people are trying to have influence through markets, whether it's crowdfunding the art that you want to see made, or whether it's crowdfunding the park in your city that you want to see happen, or whether it's social entrepreneurship to try to figure out how to do change at scale in a way that's sustainable, or whether it's good old-fashioned trying to pass a law, I really think that the path forward through news is to go back to sort of our second bottom line. If we look at the news industry as a place that needs a fiscal bottom line and a civic bottom line, what I actually worry about is that we're failing more on our civic bottom line. We may be producing, whether this is professional news organizations, whether this is amateur news organizations, information that isn't helping us take civic action. And so I'm really interested in this question of if we say we may be at a moment where a lot of people are interested not just knowing what to vote for, what's happening in the world, but where can they have influence? Where can they have efficacy? What is a lever that they can grab a hold of and try to move? We have the possibility of people who care about the news, of building news that empowers them. We have the possibility of building news that helps people see where they could have a change and where they could have an influence. I think we're really bad at it at this point. I think we're really bad at it in part because we're terrified of being accused of advocacy journalism. I think this notion that, somehow we're going to say taxes are too high and by the way, we're holding a rally in Washington, D.C., come join our Tea Party, that's the only model for linking news to civics. And there's got to be some sort of a continuum between we report on something, but we don't give you any possibility of having influence or agency, all the way up to we're going to create a controversy and we're going to tell you how to mobilize around it. There is a lot of space in between that. And there's people who are working on it. There's sites like Shout About that try to figure out how they tack onto journalism different ways of getting involved with an issue. But I really think for those of us who write news, trying to figure out how we write about an issue, how we enter in the solutions part of it that folks like David Bornstein are doing and sort of saying, here are people looking for change on this issue, but even going for a step further and sort of saying, here are the different paths to change around this. Here are the different ways that people would and could assert influence around this. I think we have the possibility of rebuilding news based around helping people figure out how to build and participate in civics. And if you buy that argument, I want to make the case that the place to do this right now is around Snowden's revelations. That there's no way around some of these challenges of pervasive government surveillance just by finding our way through it on the tech. I've been spending a lot of time talking with people like Bruce Schneier who've been looking at the documents and have been sort of finding out what we know about government surveillance. And I've become really terrified for journalism. And I'm terrified because I think it's very, very hard for us to ensure sources any sort of anonymity and secrecy at this point. What smart people who've been looking at these documents are basically saying is that when you have enormous buildings filled with hackers, they will compromise your crypto, not by breaking the math, but by getting access to your laptop and getting access to the information you're sharing. This is not a problem we can code our way around. It's incredibly laudable that we go out and we encourage people to use better crypto and better security for their sources, but we're missing the point if we don't go after this with all four of these tools in the toolkit. We need technology that makes it easier to encrypt and protect our communications. We need to start punishing the companies that are making it really easy for governments to snoop on speech, and we need to start rewarding the ones who are brave enough to actually take a stance. We need to change our norms so that encryption is something that people do all the time, and it's not just something that you do when you have a secret to hide. But this is a place where it's really critical for the journalism community, for the technology community, for everybody to stand up and actually demand the legal change around this. And for me, this becomes a place where I would really love to see serious journalists taking the lead and trying to figure out how we can take on this power of advocacy and essentially advocate for our own self-interest, that it's very, very hard to continue doing what we do if we can't assure people of security, and that form of advocacy and trying to help people get involved in a movement to curb some of these abuses, to me seems somewhere well far short of the advocacy journalism that we're scared of and well in the space of the advocacy journalism that we care about. Look, crazy talk all over the place. I wanted to put it out because I wanted feedback from you guys. The basic idea behind this, I think we're at a moment where after many, many years of people talking about civics in crisis, I'm actually really excited about it. I'm excited about all the different ways that people can participate. For those of us in the news, I think we have this incredible opportunity, which is to think of our job first and foremost about how we help people be citizens, not just giving them the information and telling them how to vote, but helping them think through all these different ways, all these different tools they could use. That's what I'm working on. I'm giving this crazy sprawling talk because I could really use your help sort of figuring this out. The mic is open. I really appreciate you listening. Please, shut it up.
I was looking into government subsidies for postal stamps.
Yep.
They used to function for over 100 years. And I was wondering, how do you think we can make that work in the 21st century where distribution is more digital?
So postal stamps are a great example of sort of change around market mechanisms, right? So when you first get the postal system in the United States, it has an enormous subsidy for newspapers. And the reason it has an enormous subsidy for newspapers is you have the intention of the early postmaster, Franklin and others, to create a public sphere instead of a republic of letters. So to have journals that circulate widely, to have letters that sort of go back and forth in it. It's really, really cheap to get a newspaper. It's more expensive to get a letter. It's incredibly cheap to get someone else's newspaper if you're also a newspaper publisher. So you have these exchange copies moving back and forth so that you can get news from other newspapers, print it, and share it. But you've created a giant government subsidy mechanism designed to have speech in that space. You could imagine us subsidizing in similar ways today. You could go after and subsidize rural broadband access, as my state, Massachusetts, is actually trying very hard to do right now, so I can continue to live in the mountains and participate in political debates. You could, and whether or not this is a good idea has really been called into question by what's happened recently, you could try to find a way to subsidize platforms for speech. So, back up 6 months, back up pre-Snowden, and what a lot of us were worried about, my friend Rebecca McKinnon, who wrote a wonderful book, Consent of the Networked, was really worried about the fact that we basically ceded our free speech platforms, all of our public dialogue platforms, to private companies, and that those private companies have no guarantee that they're going to protect rights to speech. So Facebook can decide that it really, really, really doesn't like breastfeeding. And so it's going to block all of those photos. And there's very little that you can do because your relationship with Facebook is a contract of adhesion. You've signed on to this contract. You haven't negotiated. And so far, we haven't figured out how to be effective citizens of Facebook. And so one thing that people have sort of looked on this has said, well, geez, maybe this is something that we need governments to do. Maybe governments need to try to create this public space for us. I think it's wholly unrealistic, sort of in the wake of recent revelations, that anyone's going to propose that as a serious solution. But that's sort of where a market-driven solution could sort of come into play on this, and I think that's where the notion of subsidy might potentially be helpful.
So I wanted to jump in with a question of my own. So it kind of seems like you're developing this theory of how attention and media attention and the media moderates attention and how that can sort of impact back on Lessig's 4 levers on behavior. And I'm wondering, just to hear you sort of ruminate a little bit more about the connection between those 2 things. I mean, did Lessig forget a 5th lever, or is this just a sort of all-encompassing lever that pushes on the other 4 levers in different ways and different combinations?
Yeah, so this is my poor job of connecting things. When I'm talking about attention, I think that mostly takes place in the space of norms. So I think that when people are trying to shape behavior through shaping social norms, the first thing they do is they try to seize attention. So I think when you basically say shooting an unarmed black man is a real problem and it actually should start a conversation about race, that's a normative statement. It's moving from this is something that happens, young black men get killed all the time, it's not news, to sort of showing up and saying, no, that's news, and we're actually going to have a conversation about it. That's trying to look for change within that space of norms. So what I'm actually trying to say, and what I've said ineptly here, is that I think that these sort of multifaceted citizens, when I'm sort of fascinated by an Assange or a Snowden, I think they're playing very, very well with perhaps 3 of these 4 levers. I think they're doing fine in the spaces of code and in law and in sort of attention and norms. I think for the most part they haven't done well in markets, and I think the WikiLeaks blockade is actually kind of a nice example of what happens when you don't get the markets right, and it suddenly gets very hard to do all the rest of them. But I think that this space of attention, this space of norms, may be a space that we don't spend enough time thinking about or talking about because it's so easy access. I think for all of us these days who create and disseminate media, this is the space in which we work every day. When you come out and say, Jesus, that was a really weird talk Zuckerman gave over at the Tao Center, you are creating media and you're putting a norm out there and you're shaping things in one fashion or another. We do it constantly. And because we're swimming in it, it is the natural first tool and first lever that most of us reach for. And I think it's sort of desperately under-theorized. Like I think we have these phrases that drive me nuts. People say things go viral. Things don't go viral. There's a pattern somewhere that we can explain for why something got a huge amount of attention. We just don't know what the pattern is, so we sort of wave our hands around it. So I think this is a really powerful lever. I think it's a lever that people are accessing all the time now, and I think we really sort of owe it to ourselves to try to figure out how we understand it and how we understand the ecosystems around it. Hands up here and here.
In terms of the techniques and tools for influence, in terms of how information is dispersed, if you can make it easier with new tools to engage and consume information better and more intelligently in terms of data and bias, what are your sort of thoughts on that? What do you think that kind of tool might sort of be?
So I'm not a big believer that access to information and transparency by itself is the quickest path to change things. I actually think that's part of the progressive fallacy that Michael talks about in some of his work, of sort of assuming that if we just had as much information as possible out there, people would sort of go and inform themselves and sort of work from there. And for me, for things like the Sunlight Foundation, which I really love and respect, that's sort of where the work falls down a little bit. It's sort of this assumption that you put the information out there, a journalist, a citizen, someone will find it, and that's therefore going to lead to change. And I actually think it's a much more complicated path. You would actually have to say, how do you get from that information out there to these different paths to social change? Does that information turn into outrage and mobilization? Does it turn into influence on a lawmaker? How do you actually get to the point where you get from that information to somewhere else? A lot of the stuff that we're starting to experiment with Center for Civic Media is actually kind of inverting the paradigm somewhat and basically saying, it's not just about opening the data and putting it out there. Maybe the answer is actually not to open the data, but to sort of ask you to create the data. And in the process of creating and finding the data, does that get you more involved and to care about it in a different way? And I'll give sort of a tangible example of all of this. One of the projects that is based partly at Center for Civic Media is a project called SafeCast, which monitors radiation in Japan. So Fukushima melts down, a bunch of Japanese people sort of go, I know that the Japanese government isn't telling us the truth about Fukushima, we need Geiger counters. They discover that you can't get Geiger counters because they've all been bought by housewives in Iowa who want to make sure that the radiation isn't coming across the Pacific and infecting their children. So they start building Geiger counters. So they do an open hardware Geiger counter. And they do it in a really interesting way. They put it in a box with a GPS receiver. So you can sort of put this box, they start with bento boxes from lunch, right? And you hang it on the back of a motorbike. And you drive around, and every 5 seconds it takes a radiation reading, and then you take the card out of it and you upload it, and you get a map of what the reading was in different locations. And so now you can go to SafeCast and you can get this just utterly gorgeous map of radiation levels all throughout Japan because people are driving all over the place. And now the Japanese Postal Service uses these meters, and you have that. So I've got one of these. I have the Geiger counter sitting in my office, and so I've started getting interested in mothballed nuclear plants, which there are just a ton of in like rural America. And I live way out in western Massachusetts, and Yankee Row nuclear plant is 12 miles from where I live. So I take my Geiger counter and I go out to Yankee Row and I drive up and I'm trying to figure out whether there's radiation at the facility, and I get stopped by very nice gentlemen who are carrying M16s who explain that I'm not coming any closer to the radioactive waste, thank you very much. And I don't actually find anything. I mean, I basically don't get any radiation readings. But I get really interested in this question of radiation and waste and what's going on, and we're putting it over time. And to me, it seems like this is another path towards getting people engaged. I think just looking at a map that sort of says, nope, no radiation, doesn't give you much to go with. That experience of sort of going out and saying, can I collect the data? What do I have to learn about it? How do I think about it? That to me seems like inverting this paradigm into a more participatory direction. And at the end of the day, you know, my goal is to somehow turn civics from a spectator sport into a participatory sport. And so for me, that's where I want to go, sort of on the open data side of it.
So back here next.
Hi. You told us about all these advocates who try to stir a debate like on their issue. So there's someone who's doing something for the LGBT community and someone like Edward Snowden about national security. And if media debates and civic debates are stirred like by different people and they have all their own issues, what does that to society? Because journalism, of course, has its own bias, but it's maybe a little bit more broader. What does the change?
So I think this is in the direction of what you're asking, and I apologize if it's not, but I'm going to try from there. I think what's hardest about this model that I'm sort of positing, where you have more active citizens trying to make change about the issues that they care about, is that it's very hard to know what it actually means for a public, right? So it's possible that what we're actually having, this may actually be a pretty good description of what the internet looks like right now, is everyone standing and yelling about the issue that they care about, and not necessarily a lot of dialogue and a lot of common ground around it. And part of this is that we haven't gotten very good at actually building those deliberation debate systems online. Anyone who's tried to have an online debate knows that it actually is just categorically different than the offline debate. But I'm starting to think that there may be sort of a way to think about this, which is basically saying it's not reasonable for me to care about Syria and the NSA and date rape and feminism online. And I can't be involved with all of those things. But I can be passionate about the 2 or 3 issues that I'm knowledgeable about and where I see a path towards change. And much in the same way that you see authors like Kovac and Rosenstiel talk about this notion of interlocking publics. Maybe we become an informed public because I watch African news really closely because I lived and worked in Africa a good chunk of my life. You watch Japanese news because you've lived and worked there. And together, collectively, maybe we get a view of the world. I'm actually wondering if we have a path towards sort of an interlocking civics through activism. These are the issues that I care about. And I care a lot about them. And if you're in my immediate orbit, you may care a little bit about them because you hear me talk about it all the time. And I may care a little bit about the issue that you care about, and collectively we start looking like some form of a functioning public. Now, how we get there from a point where we're all advocating, we're all marshaling all of our forces, to a point where we actually compromise and have dialogue, I don't have a good solution to that. And I'm in good company. Like, I don't think anyone has a good solution to it. But it seems to me like a model that starts representing at least a little bit of where we are. And if it starts as a descriptive model, we can think about how it gets to a normative model. So totally with you on this question of how do we get from this as a description of what may be going on, what may be non-desirable, to a desirable form of civics. My hope on it is that what it lets us do is essentially have people within our circle identify the issues that they care about, become the specialists, become the advocates around it, and try to influence the people around them, and that starts taking us towards a different way of thinking about a public.
So I actually have a question from Twitter, from Alex Howard. He asks, what digital literacy programs are working?
So I actually think programs like Spark, which I referred to with Carmen Rios, are pretty good, at least around some aspects of this. I look at a group like the Harry Potter Alliance that hangs out with us at Center for Civic Media. Harry Potter Alliance is a bunch of Harry Potter fans who decided that the appropriate way to honor the books was to try to bring Dumbledore's army into reality by sort of identifying issues like inequality and fighting for GLT rights, and have now tried to bring it sort of into campaigning. And I think these sorts of organizations are actually doing a pretty good job of training people to sort of work in the norms and sort of attention space. I think probably my favorite single organization in this space right now is Policy Mike, which is explicitly a left-right bridging project trying to get people on the left and right of the US political spectrum to get good at writing op-eds and basically sharpening their skills by sparring with the other side online. And I think they do a really gorgeous job of sort of trying to get young people in particular to sort of figure out how to play with this. As far as digital literacies, I think we've just gone through sort of a long wave of this. I think we've just gone through sort of 10 or 15 years of people sort of going, well, I can get involved with open source software, and maybe that's going to be my path towards entrepreneurship, and maybe that's going to be my path towards fame and fortune. For me, in many ways, I'm actually much more concerned about civic literacy than I am about digital literacy at this piece of time. And where I'd really love to see is, if we're getting people getting good at this sort of attention and norms sphere of the game, can we help people get better at some of these other parts of the game? I think markets are a really interesting piece of this. I've got a student right now, Rodrigo Davies, writing his thesis on civic crowdfunding. So he's really interested in this idea that people can get together on crowdfunding platforms and try to raise the money for things that you would normally expect a government to do. And this is an interesting and complicated and possibly troubling development. I mean, do you lose public goods theory if suddenly we're crowdsourcing everything? Do we lose the value of having taxes? But he's sort of interested in this as again, sort of like another tool in the toolkit. If you're going to have change, somewhere you have to figure out how to pay for things, how to have markets. And if it turns out that we can come together at a small level and sort of provision things we want to provision, maybe that becomes another tool of it. I would love to see people, I would love to see my center and your center and everybody else's center trying to figure out how we teach these sort of capabilities of civics, not just the digital ones.
I think it's a lot easier for me to get my head around the idea of some kind of civic journalism that engages people on a local level, because we know how to reach the people who have to make the change or make the decisions. But I'm interested in the international sphere where there are issues where the decision is made by extremely powerful people or governments, for example, a dictator or China, and you have some issue that people feel completely powerless about, and so they throw up their hands. And I'm just curious where you see any available developments between the idea of the old-fashioned letter-writing campaign, where a dictator had a million letters fall on his doorstep, and now when people are just talking about things online.
So international is a really fun challenge in this space, and I'm with you. Most of my academic work before I got sort of led down the civics path was on technology in sub-Saharan Africa. So at the end of the day, for me, a lot of the politics that I care about is on the African continent, and you sort of raised this question of, what am I meaningfully going to do about Equatorial Guinea? But it actually turns out that these opportunities sort of present themselves, right? So Equatorial Guinea has terrible problems based on the fact that everybody's figured out that it's a kleptocracy, and it's working really, really hard to sort of improve its international image. So it hosted a huge African diaspora and civil rights conference last year. And civil society activists responded by basically like shaming everybody who was showing up to it. And so these massive Twitter campaigns sort of going after African-American celebrities who were going to go to Equatorial Guinea and world leaders who were going to go there, and managed to basically like crash the conference and essentially have it not happen. You now have a wonderful Twitter feed in the name of President Teodoro Obiang, which basically complains that all the other dictators out there aren't nearly the dictator that he is, and sort of humiliation and sort of, and so these are very oblique ways of going about it. But essentially, it's people essentially saying, one of the few things we can try to do for this government is try to turn it into an international pariah state. One of the ways to turn it into a pariah state is to take a place that most people can't find on the map, make it the butt of the joke, make it the source of shame and outrage. So I think that where you're right in your question is sort of saying, when we look locally, we think we know where the spaces of change are. I think what happens in this sort of participatory view of civics that I'm talking about is that it's incumbent on you sort of early on to sort of say, what am I trying to change? Who has the power over it? How am I going to influence them? Where does it go? And I think where this gets really confusing is that because we have so many different tools for participation, it sort of seems like the answer is, let's jump in and do something. And I think that the next step after that has to be, let's try to understand how we could imagine change actually happening, who we would have to influence to have that change, and then how we would actually work to sort of influence those people. And that's the sort of thing that activists are really used to doing sort of on a local basis. And we're now starting to figure out how you sort of do this on national and international bases. And some techniques, sort of come up again and again. Boycotts actually work in many cases. Naming and shaming can work in certain cases. There are certain international institutions that are more likely than others to sort of take action on it. But that space of looking at something tactically and sort of figuring out where's the space for influence, if you're going to take on this notion of effective citizenship, for me that seems like a critical piece of it.
That was a wonderfully interesting talk, I found, and you got the good citizen exactly right, and took it.
I've been terrified about this question, by the way, so I've been shuddering all through this talk. So.
A couple of questions or thoughts. One is, it's interesting what you said that about Trayvon Martin. Television was what really made the story, and then in some other spaces it's online, and I would add in some other spaces it seems to be, strangely enough, newspapers.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
And whether you have from your work or other work that a map of what kinds of things go in what medium best. That's
Yep.
one question.
Yep.
Another, you don't have to answer all these, but you spark a lot of them. Another concerns you're pretty. One place where I think I may disagree with you has to do with the value of objectivity or neutral, a neutral stance in journalism or elsewhere. you know, I'm doing some historical research on the Democratic Study Group, which was basically intended as an advocacy group for liberals in the Congress. And at one point, they hired as their executive director a journalist who said, what we have to do is establish our credibility, and let's do some research, and let's make sure we put the best argument we can for the liberal side and the best argument we can for the conservative side, and put that out as a newsletter. And it turned out they got subscribers not only from the Democrats, but some renegade Republicans, not to mention all the journalists in Washington. And they were scrupulous about being neutral. Anyway, that's the second. And the third question is just a sort of simple one, or maybe it's not simple. But you said the Center for Civic Education is working at how do we teach civics? And I just listening to you, I thought maybe there's another question there, which is where do we teach civics?
Yeah.
You didn't talk about schools much. Anyway, it's enough.
So let me work backwards on it. So I think for Center for Civic Media, we're trying to figure out, first what we would teach in teaching civics. And I think in teaching civics, a lot of it for us would be documenting what people are doing now, documenting these tactics, documenting how they're working, documenting whether they're working well or not. In the long run, I do think it's interesting to think about how you would construct it as a curriculum. But I don't think I'd construct it as a curriculum in the schools. And my experience with people who are trying to teach civics in the schools is that it triggers for people on all political spectrums this notion of indoctrination. And I think it's really hard to teach civics in the abstract without teaching it in the most abstracted and practical ways. Like, I think part of the reason that the way we teach civics in schools hasn't grown up a ton from I'm just a bill, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting there on Capitol Hill, is that when you go further and sort of say, oh, and by the way, the Farm Bill, that's really terrible. Like, not only is it terrible for public health, but it's terrible for Africa and it's terrible for your taxes. You really ought to do something about it. Someone comes back in and you're no longer teaching in a public school. So I think doing it in an educational context is probably easier in college than it is in high school. I think it's probably easier to do after school and in some sort of other space than it is necessarily within the academic space. And I think the big thing that I would say about it is that I see, at least in the applications of sort of students coming into undergrad right now, activism is becoming almost like a mandatory part of education, if only to sort of flesh out your resume. And so I'm actually kind of interested in the ways in which people who are sort of looking to get into an awesome school like Columbia are sort of finding ways to have activism be part of what they're doing, and then sort of think about this question of how we would educate that way. So that would be where I'm focusing on that. Neutrality is a really long and complicated one. Let me just put a pin on what I'm actually saying. And again, I think I'm saying it badly because this immediately gets us into triggers, and I have to give that piece of the talk at the Neiman Foundation next week, and I'm already shaking in my boots about sort of how to give that one. Whenever we pay attention to one thing over another, that's a bias. If we decide that Syria leads tomorrow in the New York Times, rather than the NSA, rather than reacting to the Navy Yard shooting, that's a bias. Bias doesn't mean you're a bad person. The bias doesn't mean that it maps neatly to left or right politics. It means that that iterated pattern of behavior over time shows what you're paying attention to and what you're not paying attention to. You could try for being unbiased by working as hard as you can to sort of find the views from all of there, but you still have that question of prioritization. What do you pay attention to, what you put out there? And I think this is simply the problem that Herbert Simon gives us. Once you have more information in the world than any of us can actually deal with, someone has to be in that position of filter. And if you're doing the agenda setting as an editor, you are putting some biases forward. I agree with you entirely. I think as an editor, as a curator, there is enormous value in doing what Fox News claims they do, in reporting and letting you decide, and actually trying to be fair and balanced. And in no way do I reject the notion of striving for fairness and balance and striving for a wide multi-spectrum view of things. What I do reject is that concept of neutrality, because for me, neutrality misses that power over attention that you're putting in by saying, I'm going to be an agenda-setting agent. And so I'm asking everybody to sort of admit the bias. I admit the bias when I'm tweeting out whatever I'm going to amplify tomorrow. I'm asking newspapers to admit it, and then figure out how we work within that. So maybe it ends up being semantic, but to me, it's actually kind of an important distinction. We are way too early for me to be able to tell you, here's a story that spreads via paper news, via broadcast, via something else. We're going after that question in two ways. So we have a set of tools that we call controversy mappers, which let us basically sort of unroll a controversy as it spreads through a media ecosystem. And our tool there is we sort of step through it day by day. We look at intensity in different media. So we look, here it's getting a lot of love in the newspaper today, very little in broadcast media, some in social media. And we look at links. So we look at who's linking to whom. And over time, we're trying to get to tracking frames. So not just who explicitly links to one, but when do we all start talking about Trayvon and the hoodie? And who managed to get that frame out there, and how does that sort of go in? So that's one set of tools. The other set of tools are sort of what I'm calling meters. And these are basically like weather reports. I want to be able to say the New York Times right now is looking a lot at Latin America and Europe and not a lot at Africa. And maybe that weather changes over time. But I don't just want to do where, I also want to do who and what. And it turns out that computationally, where is pretty simple. You need a dictionary of about 8 million place names, and you can do pretty good geo-disambiguation from that. Who gets a little harder? You need a slightly bigger database. You need good guesses on gender. You'd really love to be able to make guesses about age and ethnicity over time, and that gets hard. Because you'd like to be able to say, hey, this week the New York Times quoted this many women and this many people of color, and in stories about women, you quoted the following. And what is really hard. Like getting topic and doing that automatically, that for us is sort of the holy grail and all of that. So we're moving towards that as we get there, both from case study and elsewhere. I hope to be getting to the point where I can give you better answers to that. Thank you very much for those questions.
Hi, I'm from the Berkshires, so it's good to know that you didn't find any radiation in your search. I saw the Fifth Estate last week, and so I've sort of had WikiLeaks on the mind. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, what went wrong, and what would have to change for there to be a new and better WikiLeaks?
I haven't seen the film yet. I got to read the script because I have a cameo in it. I actually show up, there's at one point where they show a Twitter feed of people talking about WikiLeaks, and I'm in the Twitter feed, which made me very happy. And they actually vetted the script by me to make sure that they could use my identity on Twitter, which made me very happy. So the interesting thing about WikiLeaks is that nothing technically went wrong with WikiLeaks, right? So there's sort of all the things that you would think of sort of breaking the encryption or sort of finding the files that were out there, all of that seemed to work. When this happened, he was Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning. Manning, talked to the wrong person. And that's how she found herself in custody. Where WikiLeaks, I think, went wrong is a much bigger question of sort of what it means to be a whistleblower. And I think that WikiLeaks very early on, I was talking to Julian a lot before the Manning documents. And at that point, he was getting a lot of individual leaks. And they were really interesting if you were interested in the parts of the world where they were. He was getting a lot of interesting documents out of Kenya, putting them up, trying to get people to give background information on it, trying to figure out the political import of that. That all seemed laudable and worthwhile. The collateral murder video seemed to me like advocacy journalism in sort of the clearest sense, with both the good and the bad. I think there was sort of no attempt at that point to sort of say we're neutral on this. It was very much, we found this, we're going to crusade, we're going to get attention to this. Where I think things get very complicated was when you suddenly have this incredible wealth of documents that might or might not have malfeasance in them, that might or might not have bad things in them. And then when that turns into a leak, like, I'm not sure that's a leak. I think that's a source of numerous possible leaks. And I think, I don't want to argue against the legality and appropriateness of releasing documents, but it's a lot harder for me to make the case for the civic and political value of releasing all those diplomatic cables versus how Snowden's done it. And I think Snowden's actually kind of shown what we learned from WikiLeaks, where Snowden's been incredibly careful about bringing out the documents one by one, with a very clear agenda of what he sees as the malfeasance, with very careful journalists working on it. I think WikiLeaks may have been sort of an essential step we had to go through to get to more impactful, thoughtful leaking in a digital age. All sorts of questions about when WikiLeaks became about Julian rather than about a movement, but I think on the substance side of it, that would be probably the distinction I try to draw.
So before we let Ethan go for the evening, we have one more question.
That's a really good segue, actually. That's a very interesting topic there with WikiLeaks and Julian, because of the way it was framed and how that changed across time. And listening to Julian in one of his interviews, I think, after Snowden began leaking the documents, he got very irritated during one of them. And it was because he had and he's acutely aware of this, that the debate had been changed from leaks of documents to chase around the world and where will Snowden end up next. And he's very irritated because he can see this happening and the debate's changing, and he's working out ways in which to frame the debate for the issues that he wants to bring up. And I think that that's perhaps what's happening, and it goes to the core of what you're saying. I hope this comes to a question in the end. But it might just be throwing a little bit of information out there or a perspective. That in the past, the debate's been framed by certain people or institutions. So in the past, it might have been, I'm Rupert Murdoch, I control all these companies, I say what people are going to think. Perhaps where we're going now is that all of these other voices are coming up where we can start determining what's said, and we're trying to work out, how do you do that? Do you go through regular media? Do you have to come up with a sticky message? Do you have to hit the right people? And I'm curious, I mean, you said we're not there yet, but is it trust? Is it the message? Is it taking what people are already thinking and reflecting to that?
So one of my closing slides said media ecosystems are battlegrounds. And I think that's precisely it. There's an old model of agenda setting that says we have the daily newspaper and the editor, perhaps controlled by the sinister hand of the publisher, decides what's news, and based on what's news, that's going to be what we talk about, whether it's what we think or not, right? So Murdoch controls, any number of papers, and we report on this and not on that, and that sort of shapes how we think. And that's not where we are anymore, right? We're now in this sort of world of networked agenda setting, where it's possible that even if it isn't showing up in the Times of London, even if it isn't showing up in the Guardian, you can find ways to sort of get attention to it. And actually that's where sort of Yochai goes with Sopa Pipa. He sort of says, here's an issue that's only being talked about in sort of like insider newsletters in Congress, and it turns into a giant populist consumer issue because it bubbles up from the digital realm. Now understand that Yochai's agenda in this is that he really wants the network public sphere to be the new powerful space where conversations take place. I think, maybe I'm more cynical, maybe I'm more pragmatic, I think broadcast media is still enormously important. And so I see a lot of people trying to influence broadcast media and sort of try to find a space within there. But what I would say is we're here, we're soaking in it. Every day when you open a newspaper, when you look at a blog, when you look at someone else's Twitter feed, you are seeing the result of the battle of the previous day of people demanding attention, of people asking for certain things to be paid attention to, paying attention to some, ignoring others. You can look at it through a political lens of here's someone's politics and here they end up shaping it, and maybe it makes sense for someone as big as important as Murdoch. But for most of us, we actually have to sort of analyze it as these webs and these ecosystems and where those lines of power are starting to go. As far as where we go with it, there are people who are starting to figure out how to harness a whole boatload of attention. Coney 2012 turns out to be a lovely primer in how you gain attention. If you simply want lots and lots of people to see something and spread it and share it, you can make an extremely simplistic message. It can oversimplify a situation. It can prey to people's guilt. It can prey to their ability to be involved. It can leverage on top of a celebrity. There's all sorts of patterns there as far as getting it to spread. What that message didn't do was figure out the levers to move. It had no idea how to actually solve the problem that it was trying to solve. So it got this giant mass of attention that wasn't able to actually lead towards change. And it's probably what ends up sort of destroying Jason Russell in the process. He's got so much attention and sort of no way to channel it. So I think people are starting to figure out how to hack it and where to go with it. I think very few people are figuring out how to master both the attention piece of it and actually the change piece of it. And for me, that's where the research goes, and that's where sort of thinking about this stuff goes. Guys, you're awesome. You've been really patient. I appreciate you letting me try out very new ideas on this. Any of you want to talk about this, you can find me. I really do respond to email. Sometimes it takes a couple of days. I respond even faster to Twitter. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.